There were no doctors on most streets, no pharmacies, no running water, no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or infection. And yet, millions of people lived, worked, raised children, and grew old in first-century Judea, in one of the most densely populated, disease-prone regions of the ancient Mediterranean world. How did they survive? The answer is not luck. It is not ignorance either. It is something far more fascinating. A centuries-old architecture of habit, ritual, material culture, and social structure that functioned, without anyone fully understanding why, as a shield against invisible death. A system built not in laboratories, but in kitchens, courtyards, marketplaces, and synagogues. Encoded not in medical textbooks, but in religious law, family tradition, and the texture of daily life. And when you understand how that system worked, what it looked like, smelled like, felt like from the inside, the words of Jesus take on a weight and a precision that modern readers almost always miss. Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. Picture a village in the Galilee region, sometime around the first decades of the first century. Not the romanticized Galilee of painted glass windows. No soft light, no neat pathways. The real Galilee, a landscape of volcanic basalt rock, pale limestone dust, terraced hillsides, and the constant smell of animals. The village itself is small, perhaps 200 to 500 people, tightly clustered. The houses are built from the same stone that surrounds them, one room pressed against another, sharing walls to conserve warmth in the cold season and shade in the brutal summer heat. The streets, if you can call them that, are narrow and unpaved. In winter, they fill with mud and animal waste. In summer, the same waste dries into fine dust that rises with every footstep and enters the lungs with every breath. There are no drainage systems. Waste from animals and humans accumulates along the edges of pathways, near doorways, beside the wells where women gather water in the early morning hours before the heat becomes unbearable. This is the environment. And in this environment, disease was not a rare emergency. It was a permanent neighbor. Dysentery killed children before their second birthday with terrifying regularity. Skin infections spread through shared tools and contaminated water. Eye diseases, trachoma in particular, blinded men and women in their productive years. Intestinal parasites were so common that the physical symptoms of infestation were simply part of what it meant to be alive and poor in the ancient world. Fevers appeared suddenly, without explanation, and could take a person from full health to death within days. If you want to understand how people in this world lived without modern medicine, you have to first understand how profoundly present death was. Not as an abstraction, but as something that walked through the same narrow streets you walked through, that drank from the same cistern, that touched the same bread. And yet, the community survived, generation after generation. With no germ theory, no microscope, no sterilization protocols, and with survival rates that, while lower than ours, were high enough to sustain a civilization. The reason lies in something so ordinary it is almost invisible: water management. Before anything else, before food, before prayer, before work, there was water. And in first-century Judea, water was not a convenience. It was a weapon against invisible contamination, even if no one used that language. Every household of even modest means had a mikveh, a ritual immersion pool, or access to one nearby. These pools were carved directly into the limestone bedrock beneath homes and courtyards, fed by rainwater collected from rooftops through carefully constructed channels. The mikveh was not, in the mind of its users, a hygiene device. It was a theological instrument. It restored ritual purity, a status that governed who could enter sacred spaces, handle sacred objects, participate in communal meals, and touch certain categories of food. But here is what is remarkable. The practical effect of mikveh immersion was, whether anyone recognized it or not, the regular washing of the entire body with relatively clean water. Not the hands only, not the face, the entire body, submerged. This happened not once a week, but repeatedly, after contact with the dead, after certain kinds of illness, after childbirth, after menstruation, before entering the temple, before significant communal events. The theological framework demanded it. The biological consequence was a population that bathed their bodies far more frequently than most of the ancient world, and far more frequently, in fact, than many populations in medieval Europe more than 1,000 years later. This is one of the first layers of the system, a religious obligation that functioned invisibly as a public health protocol. The mikveh water itself was regulated. Jewish law required that the water be mayim hayim, living water, or water gathered naturally, not stagnant. A pool could not be filled with drawn water alone. It needed rainwater or spring water. This distinction, which reads to modern eyes as purely symbolic, had a real consequence. It excluded the most bacterially contaminated water sources. Standing water in open containers, water that had been sitting in the heat for days, from use in immersion. No one designed this as a sanitation rule. It was a theological one, and yet its effect was sanitary. Now walk into a house. Step through the low doorway. You must duck slightly, and let your eyes adjust to the interior shade. The floor is packed earth or, in more prosperous homes, fitted stone. There is a single large room that serves most functions: sleeping, eating, storage, and in cold weather, housing for the smallest and most vulnerable animals. The air smells of smoke from the clay cooking hearth, of dried herbs hanging from wooden pegs, of the particular warm animal scent of wool and skin. Along one wall, raised slightly on a stone platform, are the sleeping mats, rolled and stored during the day. Near the center, or pushed toward one wall, is the hearth, a low installation of stone or hardened clay with a flat surface for baking bread. The fuel is dried dung, olive wood, or dried grass, whatever is available. The smoke has no chimney. It rises, thickens, and slowly escapes through a gap in the roof or a high opening in the wall. Smoke, it turns out, is not only a cooking byproduct, it is a fumigant. It kills insects. It dries meat and prevents fungal growth. It raises the temperature of the upper part of the room, creating an environment less hospitable to certain parasites. No one in that kitchen understood the mechanism. They understood only that smoked meat lasted longer and that certain insects avoided the air near the hearth. The consequence, reduced vectors for disease transmission, was real, even without the theory. This is how the system worked throughout. Not designed, accumulated, tested across generations of survival and failure. The practices that killed people faster were eventually abandoned. The practices that kept people alive became tradition, then law, then theology. And so the house itself, with its smoke and its stone and its rhythms, became part of the immune infrastructure of the community. Water and shelter were only the beginning. The deeper you look into the daily routines of first-century Judea, the more you begin to see that almost every repeated gesture, the way food was prepared, the way hands were washed, the way a meal was organized, the way the sick were separated from the healthy, formed part of an interlocking system of protection that no single person had consciously designed, and no single text had fully articulated. It had grown, the way coral grows, slowly, by accumulation, shaped by the pressure of a world where invisible things killed. Begin with the hands. In first-century Jewish practice, hand-washing before meals was not merely a courtesy or a personal preference. It was a matter of deep communal and religious significance. The Pharisees, the lay religious movement that had the most influence over daily practice in towns and villages throughout Galilee and Judea, had extended priestly purity rules to the common table. In the temple, priests washed their hands before handling sacred objects. The Pharisees argued that every Jewish table should be treated as a kind of altar, and every Jewish meal as a kind of sacred act. Therefore, every person who sat down to eat should wash their hands first. This was controversial. Not everyone agreed. Some found the extension of priestly rules to ordinary life presumptuous or burdensome. The debates appear in early rabbinic literature with remarkable intensity. Whole tractates devoted to the precise amount of water required, the correct method of pouring, whether water that had already been used could be used again, whether the wrists needed to be included. The granularity is almost comic to modern eyes. But behind that granularity was a practice that, regardless of the theology motivating it, removed contamination from hands before those hands touched food that would enter the body. The Gospels record a moment that now reads with entirely new weight. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, a group of Pharisees and scribes approach Jesus and ask why his disciples eat with unwashed hands that are koinais, a Greek word meaning common or ritually defiled. Jesus responds not by defending the practice of hand-washing, but by challenging the motivations of those who use ritual as a performance of status rather than a genuine expression of care. He talks about what defiles a person from the inside. He talks about the heart. Modern readers often take this passage as Jesus dismissing the importance of ritual cleanliness altogether. But that reading misses the social geography of the scene. Jesus is in Galilee. His disciples are working men, fishermen, craftsmen, laborers, people whose hands were in nets, in wood, in soil all day. The question of hand-washing was not purely theological. It was also a question about class. The Pharisees, with their carefully maintained ritual purity, were implicitly marking the disciples as inferior, as impure, as people whose table was not a sacred table. Jesus pushes back against the use of purity law as a social weapon. But he does so in a world where the practice of hand-washing and the broader architecture of ritual purity was a genuine and functional shield against contamination. He knew that world from the inside. He had grown up in it. Now, consider food itself. Not just the preparation, but the selection and prohibition. Jewish dietary law, kashrut, is among the most detailed regulatory systems in ancient religious literature. Its origins are debated. Its theological explanations are multiple and often symbolic. Holiness, distinctiveness, obedience, remembrance. But its practical effects are not symbolic at all. The prohibition on pork is the most famous example, and it has generated centuries of speculation. In the ancient Near East, pigs were vectors for a range of parasites and bacterial infections, most notably Trichinella spiralis, the roundworm responsible for trichinosis, which produces severe gastrointestinal illness and can be fatal in vulnerable populations. In a hot climate without refrigeration, without the ability to cook meat to precise internal temperatures, without any understanding of parasites, pork consumption carried a significantly elevated risk of illness. The prohibition did not come with a biological explanation. It came as divine command. But its effect, across the generations of communities that observed it, was immeasurably reduced exposure to one of the most dangerous food sources available in that climate and environment. Shellfish, also prohibited, spoil rapidly in heat and are effective vectors for certain bacterial infections and toxins. The animals permitted for consumption were predominantly ruminants, animals whose digestive systems process grass and vegetation, and which carry a lower parasite burden under the agricultural conditions of the ancient Levant. The permitted birds were largely those that fed on grain and seeds rather than carrion. None of this was articulated in biological terms. The reasoning given in the Torah is theological and symbolic. Clean animals, unclean animals, categories that reflect a larger cosmological order of holiness and separation. And yet, the practical consequence, a diet that systematically excluded the highest-risk food sources in that environment, was a form of nutritional epidemiology centuries before the concept existed. Here is what makes this historically stunning. These rules were not static. They were continuously argued over, refined, extended, and reinterpreted by generations of scholars and community leaders who had no idea they were doing epidemiology. They thought they were doing theology. They were doing both. Beyond what was eaten, consider how food was stored. In a world without refrigeration, food storage was one of the great engineering challenges of daily life. A family's survival across the dry summer and into the following spring depended on how well they had stored their grain, their oil, their dried figs, their salted fish. Poor storage meant spoilage. Spoilage, in the form of mold, fermentation, and bacterial growth, meant illness. And illness, in a body already under nutritional stress, could mean death. The primary storage vessels were ceramic, clay jars sealed with cloth, leather, or clay stoppers. Clay is porous, which creates a passive cooling effect through evaporation. A sealed clay jar, stored in the cool interior of a stone house or in a carved rock cellar, could maintain temperatures significantly lower than the outdoor air. Olive oil, one of the primary caloric and medicinal resources of the ancient diet, was stored in large sealed amphorae. The oil itself acted as a preservative, sealing out oxygen from the surface of whatever it covered. Grain was the most critical storage item and the most dangerous. Improperly stored grain, damp, poorly sealed, exposed to rodent contamination, could develop fungal growth, most dangerously ergot, a fungus that produces powerful toxic alkaloids. Ergot poisoning produces hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene of the extremities, and death. Communities that stored their grain carelessly paid for it with neurological devastation. The rules around grain storage, which appear in various forms across Jewish agricultural law, specified conditions for proper sealing, for inspection, for the separation of contaminated grain from clean grain. The granary was not merely an economic resource, it was a medical one. And when Jesus tells the parable of the grain stored in barns, the rich man who tears down his barns to build larger ones, confident in his security, the people listening to him knew exactly how precarious that security was. They knew that grain could fail, that a sealed jar could crack, that what you had today could be gone or dangerous tomorrow. The parable was not an abstraction about materialism in general. It was a story rooted in the specific anxiety of people who understood, in their bones, that stored food was both the source of life and a potential source of death, and that no amount of larger barns could guarantee safety. There is one more element of this daily protective architecture that deserves careful attention before we move forward, and it is the one that most directly shaped the social landscape Jesus moved through, the system of isolation and communal response to visible disease. Skin disease, grouped under the Hebrew term zara'at, often translated as leprosy, but encompassing a much wider range of dermatological conditions, was treated in ancient Israel with a protocol of extraordinary thoroughness. A person who developed suspicious skin changes was brought to a priest, not a physician, but a religious authority, who examined the affected area and made a determination. If the condition was deemed active and contagious, the person was declared tami, ritually impure, and was required to leave the community, to live outside the village boundaries, to call out a warning to anyone who approached, to wear torn clothes and disheveled hair, visual signals that announced their status at a distance. This was not cruelty. Or rather, it was cruelty in the service of survival. The community that sent a sick person to live outside its walls was a community that had learned, through generations of devastating loss, that proximity to certain visible conditions spread suffering further. The priest's role was not medical diagnosis in the modern sense, but the effect of the protocol was medical: isolation of the potentially infectious, separation of the sick from the healthy, and a defined process of reintegration when the condition resolved. The person declared clean after recovery was not simply allowed to return. They underwent a multi-stage ritual of purification involving water immersion, offerings, waiting periods, and priestly inspection. This process of gradual reintegration, today we would call it a quarantine protocol, ensured that no one re-entered the community's food and water systems too quickly. And then Jesus touches them. When Jesus reaches out and touches a man with tzara'at, described in the Gospel of Mark in the opening chapter, in what is one of the earliest healing accounts in that Gospel, the physical gesture itself is the theological statement, not the words that follow, not the miraculous result, the touch. To understand why, you have to stand inside the social reality of that moment with your full attention. The man with skin disease has been outside. Not outside in the casual sense of having stepped into a courtyard. Outside in the absolute sense, beyond the boundary of the community, separated from the systems of shared food, shared water, shared fire, shared conversation. He has been living at a distance from everything that defines human belonging. How long? We do not know. It could have been months. It could have been years. In that time, no one has touched him. Not a hand on the shoulder. Not a greeting. Not the accidental brush of passing too close in a narrow street. Physical contact, the most basic currency of human connection, has been entirely withdrawn. The law that mandated his isolation was not arbitrary. It had kept communities alive. It had protected children who could not protect themselves, elderly people whose bodies could not fight infection, pregnant women whose vulnerability in that world was already extreme. The isolation protocol worked, imperfectly but really, as a barrier between the sick and the healthy. Everyone who observed Jesus in that moment understood this. The disciples understood it. The crowds understood it. The man himself understood it, which is precisely why his approach to Jesus is described as an act of desperation and humility rather than a casual request. He falls to his knees. He says, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Not, "Can you heal me?" but, "If you are willing." The conditional is everything. He is not questioning Jesus' power. He is questioning whether Jesus will choose to cross the boundary that the entire community, religious, social, practical, has constructed between this man and the rest of the living world. And Jesus moved. Mark uses a word in some manuscripts that means moved with anger, in others moved with compassion, and the manuscript debate itself speaks to how charged this moment was for the early communities who preserved it. Jesus stretches out his hand and touches him before speaking, before healing. The touch comes first. In a world where the architecture of survival was built on separation, on the careful maintenance of distance between the contaminated and the clean, between the impure and the pure, between the sick and the healthy. This touch was not a minor gesture of warmth. It was a structural rupture. It said something about where the boundary of human dignity was actually located. It said something about what the law was for, and what happened when the law became a wall that trapped people rather than a gate that protected them. But the story does not end with the touch. Jesus heals the man and then gives him an instruction that is easy to read past. Go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Go to the priest. Follow the protocol of reintegration. Submit to the inspection. Perform the purification ritual. Re-enter the community through the established gate. This detail matters enormously for understanding how Jesus related to the protective systems of his world. He does not abolish the reintegration protocol. He sends the man directly into it. The system that existed to verify recovery, to confirm that the condition had resolved, to formally restore a person to communal life, Jesus honors it. He does not replace the priest's role. He sends the healed man to the priest as the legitimate authority for communal reintegration. What he refuses is the use of that system as a permanent sentence. What he refuses is the idea that the boundary between the clean and the unclean is a metaphysical wall rather than a practical and temporary one. What he refuses is the transformation of a survival protocol into a mechanism of permanent social exclusion. This is the knife edge on which Jesus consistently operates throughout the Gospels, taking the structures that existed for genuine human protection seriously, while challenging the ways those structures were weaponized against the most vulnerable people they were ostensibly designed to protect. Now move from the edges of the village back into its center, and consider the water supply again. This time not the mikveh, but the communal cistern. In most villages of first-century Galilee and Judea, the primary water supply was not a spring or a river. Springs existed and were precious. Towns were often founded around them. But for most of the population, most of the time, water came from cisterns, large underground chambers carved into bedrock, sealed with lime plaster, designed to collect and hold rainwater through the dry season. A well-plastered cistern could hold water from the winter rains through the summer months, slowly depleting as the household drew from it daily. The lime plaster used to seal cisterns was not chosen randomly. Lime, calcium hydroxide, is strongly alkaline. It raises the pH of water stored in contact with it, creating an environment hostile to many bacteria and parasites. Ancient craftsmen did not know this. They knew that properly plastered cisterns kept water better, that the water stayed fresher longer, that animals who drank from well-plastered cisterns seemed healthier, that communities with good cisterns had fewer episodes of the violent intestinal illness that swept through populations in the dry season. The knowledge was empirical, accumulated over generations of observation without theory. The maintenance of a cistern's plaster was therefore not merely a construction concern. It was a matter of communal health. A cracked cistern, one whose plaster had failed, allowing ground contamination to seep in, allowing the alkaline protection to break down, was a genuine danger. The prophet Jeremiah, writing centuries before Jesus, uses the image of a cracked cistern as a metaphor for spiritual failure. My people have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. The metaphor resonates precisely because his audience understood viscerally what a broken cistern meant. It was not an abstraction. It was thirst and illness, and the particular dread of watching your water supply slowly fail in the middle of summer. The cistern also illuminates something about social inequality that runs directly beneath the surface of Jesus' ministry. A family with a well-maintained private cistern had water security. They could draw at any time, without social exposure, without negotiating access, without the vulnerability of the communal gathering point. A family without, the very poor, recent arrivals, those whose cisterns had cracked and who lacked the resources to replaster, had to depend on communal sources. And communal water sources, precisely because they were shared, were the points of highest contamination risk. The animals that drank there, the containers that were dipped in and withdrawn, the hands that touched the rope, the bucket, the lip of the well. Water access was therefore not merely an economic issue, it was an epidemiological one. Poverty in first-century Judea meant increased exposure to contaminated water, which meant increased rates of intestinal illness, which meant reduced capacity for physical labor, which meant deeper poverty. The cycle was not invisible to the people living inside it, even if they lacked the biological vocabulary to describe its mechanism. When Jesus sits down at Jacob's well in Samaria, tired, the text says, from the journey, and asks a woman for a drink of water, the scene opens onto this entire landscape. She is there at midday, not in the cool of the morning when women typically gathered. Midday water collection was the choice of someone who preferred the heat and the solitude to the social exposure of the communal gathering. She is alone. She is Samaritan, meaning she exists outside the primary community of Jewish purity practice. She has a history, 5 husbands, a current relationship outside of marriage, that has placed her at the margins of her own community's social world. She comes to the well not because midday is convenient, but because the morning gathering, with its conversations and its social surveillance, is a place where she does not belong anymore. And Jesus asks her for water, not to demonstrate power, not to perform a miracle immediately. He asks for water. He acknowledges thirst. He places himself in the position of need, of dependence, of one who requires something from this woman who has been defined entirely by what she lacks. He crosses, again, the boundary that the architecture of separation has constructed. Jew and Samaritan, man and woman alone at a well, pure and impure by the maps his own community had drawn. And then he speaks about living water. The phrase mayim hayim, living water, which Jewish law required for valid immersion in a mikveh, which distinguished the clean-running source from the stagnant collected pool, which marked the difference between water that sustained and water that endangered. That phrase enters the conversation at the well in Samaria with its full weight of meaning intact. She hears living water and thinks immediately of what it means in the practical world. Water that flows. Water that does not run out. Water that does not require the daily labor of coming to this well in the midday heat, with the memory of everything she has lost following her down the hill. She says, "Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty and will not have to keep coming here to draw." She is not being literal and simple, as commentators sometimes condescendingly suggest. She is being entirely practical. Living water. Water that does not fail. Water that requires no exhausting daily maintenance. Water that does not run dry in the summer and does not make your children sick, was the deepest material dream of everyone in that world who had ever watched a cistern crack. Jesus takes that dream and opens it outward. He does not dismiss the physical meaning. He extends it. He takes the most urgent practical longing of a woman who has spent her life at the intersection of material deprivation and social exclusion, and he places it in contact with something larger, not instead of the physical, but through it. This is how he always works. Not from theory downward into life, but from life outward into meaning. There is a disease that appears in the Gospel accounts not with a name that modern readers would recognize, but with a description that anyone in first-century Judea would have understood immediately, in their chest, with a kind of dread that required no explanation. Hemorrhage. The woman described in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, placed by the evangelist inside the larger story of Jairus' daughter with deliberate literary precision, has been bleeding for 12 years. The text notes, with a detail so specific it feels almost like testimony, that she has spent everything she had on physicians, has suffered greatly under their treatments, and has grown worse rather than better. 12 years. Every resource exhausted, every remedy attempted, and still the bleeding continues. To a modern reader, this is a medical story. To a first-century reader, it was that. But it was also something more devastating. It was a story about someone who had spent 12 years in a state of continuous ritual impurity. Under the purity laws governing menstrual and uterine bleeding, described in the book of Leviticus, and elaborated extensively in later Jewish legal tradition, a woman with an ongoing discharge of blood was considered zava, a woman in an extended state of impurity. This was not a moral judgment. It was a ritual category, but the practical consequences of that category were total. She could not enter the temple. She could not participate in communal religious life. Whatever she touched became impure. Whoever touched her became impure until they had washed and waited until evening. The furniture she sat on, the bed she slept in, the objects she handled, all carried her impurity status. This meant that for 12 years, this woman had been, in a very real social sense, untouchable. Not with the formal protocol of the person with skin disease sent outside the village walls, but untouchable in the quieter, more pervasive way of someone whose presence made others religiously uncomfortable, whose touch created obligations of purification, whose contact with the ordinary objects of communal life required those objects to be set apart. For 12 years, she had been managing this status in a community where physical contact was the grammar of social life, where greetings involved touch, where hospitality involved sharing food and vessels, where the communal meal, the Sabbath table, the festival gathering, all the events that constituted belonging, were structured around the assumption of shared purity. She had been living at the edge of all of it for 12 years, bleeding. Now, the crowd. When she hears that Jesus is passing through, she does not go to him directly. She does not ask. She does not announce herself. She moves through the crowd. And this alone is significant, because moving through a crowd in her condition was technically a violation, a transfer of impurity to everyone she brushed against in the press of bodies. And she reaches out from behind and touches the fringe of his garment. The fringe, tzitzit, was not decorative. Under Jewish law, fringes were attached to the corners of garments as a physical reminder of the commandments, a tactile mnemonic of covenant obligation worn against the body throughout the day. To touch the fringe of a teacher's garment was to touch the outermost, most boundary-marking element of his religious identity. She reaches for the very edge of what is permitted to her. Not the garment itself, the fringe, the border. And immediately, the text says, her bleeding stops. She feels it in her body, a physical resolution, a cessation of something that has defined her existence for 12 years. And immediately, the text also says, Jesus feels that power has gone out from him. He stops. He turns. He asks, "Who touched my garments?" The disciples are baffled. The crowd is pressing in on all sides. Everyone is touching him. But Jesus does not mean accidental contact in a crowd. He means intentional touch, the kind with a purpose, with a request in it, with a history behind it. She comes forward, trembling. And the trembling is important. She knows what she has done. She has moved through a crowd while ritually impure, touching people whose purity status she has now compromised. She has touched a respected teacher, a man whose purity status mattered enormously to his public credibility. Without warning, without permission, from behind. She has, by the logic of the system, contaminated him. She tells him everything. The whole truth, the text says. 12 years. Every physician. Every treatment. Every failure. Everything she spent. The whole truth is not just the moment of touching. It is the entire 12-year story of a woman living at the margin of a community that had no mechanism for her situation. Only a purity category that named what she was, and a silence about what she was supposed to do with the life she still had to live. Jesus does not recoil. He does not immediately go to wash. He does not turn to manage the crowd's reaction or protect his public ritual status. He looks at her. This woman who has just told him 12 years of exhaustion and expenditure and isolation in a public space, trembling. And he says, "Daughter," not woman, not her name, which we are never given. Daughter, a word of kinship, of belonging, of placement inside a family structure rather than outside it. A word that moved her, in one syllable, from the category of Zava, the ritually impure, the untouchable, to the category of family member, of someone who belongs. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. The Greek word translated as made you well is sesoken, from sozo, to save, to rescue, to make whole. It is the same word used throughout the New Testament for salvation, physical healing and the restoration of wholeness. Social, relational, spiritual are not separated here. They are the same event. And what about the impurity transfer? What about the crowd she moved through, the fringe she touched, the contamination she technically spread? The text is quiet about it. Jesus does not address it. He does not perform a purification. He does not instruct anyone to go wash, go. The entire architecture of contamination transfer, the system that had kept this woman at arm's length from her community for 12 years, is rendered simply irrelevant by the direction the power moved. She reached toward him, and instead of impurity flowing from her into him, wholeness flowed from him into her. The current ran the wrong way, or rather, it ran in the only direction that, in the end, mattered. This is the pattern that emerges when you look at Jesus' engagement with disease, contamination, and the protective systems of his world with honest historical attention. He does not dismiss those systems. He grew up inside them. He knew the mikveh and the cistern and the dietary law and the isolation protocol and the priestly inspection. He knew what they were for. He knew why they had been built. He knew the generations of suffering that had made them necessary. What he refuses, consistently, precisely, and at personal cost, is the transformation of survival systems into permanent definitions of human worth. The leper's isolation was necessary and real. The bleeding woman's impurity status was theologically coherent within its own framework. The Samaritan woman's social marginality was the product of real choices and real consequences. None of this is dismissed or spiritualized away, but none of it is, in Jesus' hands, the final word about a person. The first-century world had developed, without knowing it, a sophisticated epidemiological infrastructure encoded in religious law, daily ritual, material culture, and social structure. It had done so because the alternative was mass death. And sometimes mass death happened anyway, regardless of all precautions. People understood, without germ theory, that certain contacts spread illness, that certain water sources were dangerous, that visible skin conditions required separation, that the maintenance of purity boundaries was, on some level, the maintenance of life. And into this world of careful boundaries and embodied fear and centuries of accumulated survival knowledge, Jesus moved with a freedom that was not recklessness. It was something more precise than that. It was the freedom of someone who had looked at the system, understood what it was for, and recognized that the system's purpose, the protection of human life and dignity, was sometimes better served by crossing its boundaries than by enforcing them. He touched the leper before speaking. He received water from the Samaritan woman before teaching. He allowed the bleeding woman to touch him without recoiling. He ate with people whose table was considered impure by those who measured purity in hand-washing protocols. Not because cleanliness did not matter, but because the people whom the cleanliness system had rendered permanently unclean mattered more than the system's internal consistency. In a world without germ theory, the management of disease was inseparable from the management of community. Who belonged, who was excluded, who could be touched and who could not, whose water you could drink and whose you could not. The biological and the social were one fabric. You could not pull at one thread without moving the others. Jesus understood this. He understood it not as an abstract theological proposition, but as the lived texture of the world he inhabited. The smell of the mikveh water, the sound of the priest's inspection, the sight of a woman moving through a crowd with 12 years of exhaustion behind her eyes. He was not above that world. He was inside it, completely, in all its weight and its smell and its fear. And it is from inside that world, not from above it, not from outside it, that the things he said and did carry their full force. The faith that emerges from this soil is not a faith that floats free of bodies and water and illness and the terror of contamination. It is a faith that was born precisely there, in the place where survival was uncertain and human dignity was most fragile, and the boundary between the clean and the unclean was drawn with the sharpest possible consequences. Understanding this does not reduce the gospel. It restores it to its full weight.